In this lesson, we'll talk about some of the common mesh errors that can keep our models from being checkmate compliant. So let's take a look at the specs, and we'll come down to 2.1 and take a look at the first few entries here. So any of these that are in blue, we can click on to get a little bit more information. And so the first thing that we'll talk about is we don't want to have any isolated vertices on our models. And these can come from different errors when doing things in 3ds Max. But the key is they're points that don't really contribute to the shape of the model. They're not connected to edges or faces. They're kind of, we can come in here and see. So you can see that they're not attached to a face. They don't normally cause rendering problems, as this says, but again, it is kind of confusing, and it's just kind of junk on your model that you want to get rid of. And so we want to make sure that we get rid of any isolated vertices. Also, coincident vertices. And when you see the word coincident, you can just replace that with overlapping if you like. In 3ds Max, kind of calls some of these things overlapping vertices or overlapping faces. That's kind of the same thing. It's just basically points that are right on top of one another that can cause errors. So these points can either be welded together or we can move them apart as is appropriate for whatever the situation is. But we want to avoid having those points that are right on top of one another. Also, coincident or coplanar faces. So these are faces that are right on top of each other, but they're faces that really are errors. They're supposed to, an area of the model, it's supposed to be defined by a single face, but now there's, let's say, two faces there in the same spot, facing the same direction, possibly welded together with those points, possibly not, but sitting on the same location. And so it is an error. What we're not talking about are faces that are on top of each other as far as, overlapping geometry. So the example in here is a tabletop with the legs butted up against the underneath of the tabletop. And so you've got two faces that are, in the same space really, but one's facing one direction, one's facing the other direction. They're part of different models. It's intentional. It's not an error. So those are things that those are okay. What we're talking about are errors where we have faces right on top of each other that are really supposed to be defining the same part of a model. So we'll look at how we can find those in 3ds Max. The last thing that we'll talk about are face normals. So just defining which part of the model is the outside of the model versus the inside and making sure that that's set correctly. So let's take a look here in 3ds Max. And we talked about using the checkmate tools, but let's also talk about using a tool inside of 3ds Max to find some of these errors. And that tool is called XView. And we can do it actually just in our 3D viewport. Okay. And so let's come over here to the plus, and you can see I've got XView already on here, overlapping faces, but we can change that if we want to, and that gives you that little green indicator down at the bottom. Once you've got that turned on, you can just click on this and you can choose what you want to actually see in the viewport. So let's say we want to start by looking at overlapping faces. And so we can choose overlapping faces, and then we just need to select our geometry. So we can click through some of these different pieces, and you can see that this piece here has 4 faces that are overlapping. So if we kind of look around, you can see it highlights those faces in green. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's 4 faces that we need to get rid of, but there is an issue with some faces here. And so we can kind of look and see, well, I don't really see anything. So let's go to polygon and let's start selecting things. And so I can start selecting models, and you might get lucky and be able to select the offending polygon. You can see here as I select this guy, you can see we definitely have an issue right there. Okay, that's disconnected. And so if it's not connected like that, you can come into element, and we could just, for instance, select this whole thing and move it, and you can see that there's our offending face. And so what we want to do is get that offending face isolated. So let's drag across both of those and then control click this one just to get this isolated. Then we can go ahead and delete it. Okay, now it says we have 0 faces overlapping. Now, if that face isn't separated like that, that was pretty easy to do. You may have to come in, if you still have an issue here, you may have to come in and delete that whole area. And then you can go back in here with maybe create and just kind of fill that section back in. It all really just depends on the situation. I've had instances where I've had to go in and kind of rebuild a small section of geometry because, for whatever reason, something went wrong and there's a bad face there, the duplicate faces. and it wasn't already separated, so I had to go in and kind of rebuild that. So it just depends on what the situation is as far as what you'll have to do to fix that. But XView can help you at least see it. Okay. Now, as far as the normals go, you can come in here and say, okay, now I want to look at the face orientation. And when you click on these different pieces, if it turns green, that means that that's the inside. So it's really inside out. So in this case, the trigger is inside out. So we can go to polygons. I'm going to select all the polygons, come down to edit polygons, and just flip those. And that'll help you turn that back the correct direction. Okay, now let's check for overlapping vertices. So the coincident vertices. And so let's select maybe this barrel. We can see, oh wow, we've got 150 vertices. But before we kind of take this at its word, let's make sure that we've got things set. And so I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my units are set. I'm just going to set these to generic units. And then I want to come in, and there's a tolerance in here. And this kind of tells 3ds Max how close do you want me to, how close do these points need to be before I say that they're overlapping, right? So you want this to be a very small tolerance so that you can have points that are close together that are not considered overlapping. Okay, you don't want them to be considered overlapping until they really are right on top of each other. So what we can do is we can kind of change this tolerance a bit. And you can see that things didn't really change. I've noticed that sometimes you have to kind of update things a little bit. And so if I kind of just grab, you can see here just visually that these points are not right on top of each other. And so if I just grab one of these points and just move it slightly, grab this, you can see I didn't really even move it. I just kind of selected it. But you can see that those highlighted ones go off, and now we just have 86 selected. So I'm not really sure why that's not updating, but you can see that the threshold, the tolerance level has done its job. So now we're only getting these points on the back. So if we check these, we can see by just grabbing one of these and pulling it apart that, yeah, that is actually separated out. So these are coincident or overlapping. So I can come in and we can select, drag across those points. And let's come down under Edit Vertices, and we can just weld those together. And you can see now that that point is not green anymore. So if I just click on it and drag it, that's actually been combined. Okay, and so you can come through and do that with the rest of these if you like. You can see we're reducing the number of points here. Now sometimes if you've got a lot of points like that you have to fix, it just depends on the model, but sometimes it can be easier just to rebuild that section, just as we talked about with the overlapping faces. It all really depends on the situation. In this case, maybe it's better if I would delete these and just kind of rebridge that across, but it just depends again. All right, one other thing that I did want to talk about is deleting edges. And so if you wanted to delete, let's say, an edge up here, I could double click on this, and if we just hit backspace, we would delete it, but we wouldn't know that the vertices have been left behind. And so if you want to delete an entire edge and the vertices, just remember to hit Control backspace, and that'll allow you to delete not only the edge, but also the points as well. So in addition to our checkmate script, we can also use XView to see possible errors on our model and be able to correct those very quickly. So next, let's take a look at poles. These are where lots of edges come into a single point. Now there are some poles that are inevitable and some poles that we want to make sure to avoid if we want to be checkmate compliant. So let's take a look at the difference between those in the next lesson.